I am happy to welcome you to our Montana Book Fest panel called What We Mean When We Write About the Body, where health and literature meet. Today, the four of us are going to be talking about, reading about, and thinking about experiences at the site where thinking about the physical human experience and the literary experience meet each other. So although the human body and the experiences of the body are often very private, they're also something that we share in common as humans. We have very distinct experiences, but in some ways it's one of the only places we can really come together and fully try to understand someone else's experience. Those of us in the group, and for many people, we turn to writing and literature as a way to process and make sense of these experiences. So in the writing that we're going to share with you today, we're really asking questions like, how do we make meaning of our own or others' pain or illness or limitations through writing? How does the personal become political? What's the story of the body, and how does it relate to the larger world around us? Can the experience of language be a physical experience? When we very first imagined this panel, it was before COVID. It was in January, and it was for a different event. And I feel like in the COVID world, some of those questions have a different context now about how bodies relate to each other physically. And I think that will might also be present as as a kind of an underlying layer in some of the things we're reading. So today there will be four of us reading. We're each going to go around and read a couple poems and talk a little bit about maybe the context of, or some writing, sorry, a couple minutes is what I meant to say, not all poems, and give a little context to the pieces we're reading. And then we hope to be able to have some conversation and talk a little bit when we finish. So our first reader will be Jenny Montgomery. Jenny Montgomery is an astrologer, poet, and cartoonist who is at work on a graphic memoir about disability. She earned her PhD at Columbia University, focusing on the history of wretched subjects such as astrology, divination, and magic in the Greco-Arab world. She and her family run Montgomery Distillery in Missoula. All right, take off, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yes, I'm going to share with you today something that I made for private use, and I really didn't envision a public forum for the White Devil Tarot. This is a deck of 22 oracle cards, and it's based on the major arcana of the Rider-Waite Tarot deck. And I did it to explore what I suspected was a deep reservoir of unexpressed emotion and ancestral pain connected with the past maybe 3, 4, 5 generations of my family. So like many people in the West, this is a history of colonial migration that entailed and inflicted different varieties of pain, loss, sacrifice, guilt, and just general bad karma. So I was very interested in the connection between some hereditary pain conditions in my family, and I experienced chronic headache, and looking beneath the surface at some of the hidden sources of the chronic pain epidemic in America, which over 100 million people are dealing with chronic pain, and it's costing something like $635 billion in treatment and lost productivity. So I was very interested in what is now called the biopsychosocial model of pain and illness. And we'll talk more about that. But in deciding to make the deck, I wanted to use the potency of image making, but for private purposes, not commercial consumption, not literary publishing. And I trusted in the ability of drawing and writing to access the unconscious mind and the emotional core that is hidden from rational consciousness and may be implicated in pain. So the White Devil Tarot is basically an act of storytelling that serves as a no-holds-barred container for the depths of pain, injury, rage, error, loss, etc. in one family. And I found the experience of doing it to be extremely healing, revelatory, and full of surprises. So I do have an academic background in the study of medieval astrology and divination, and these were called wretched subjects because scholars used to be embarrassed to study them. They thought it would reflect poorly on them. But Otto Neugebauer called them wretched subjects, his famous historian of science, because they were eventually cleaved from rational science, from the exact science or the pure sciences. But at one time, they were joined. So I studied the ways in which medieval doctors felt the need to cultivate skill in astrology, dream interpretation, divination, because they saw the roots of illness and healing as lying beyond the physical. So we still see the survival of this in the paradigms of, say, traditional Chinese medicine, discussion of the humors, patients running hot or dry or warm or cold. But medieval and ancient doctors would often also ascribe illness to the interference of sentient entities, such as demons, divine tricksters, or ancestral ghosts. And today, analytical psychologists might refer to these as complexes or shadow material, which can be individual, but also collective, cultural, and ancestral. So ancient doctors who could sort of peer through the veil of appearances into the realm of the unseen were felt to be the most effective healers. So early doctors like Parmenides in the 5th century BC would work through ecstasy, through the inspired interpretation of dreams, immersing themselves and their patients for extended periods of time in utter stillness in places like dark caves, in order to elicit the dreams and visions that would give information about the appropriate course of healing. So I'll talk a little bit about the deck here. So the brain, we've talked about pain, but in the biopsychosocial model of pain, we don't only look at the biological human or say the imaging that shows us what needs to be cut out or burned out or surgically rearranged or medicated, but also look at individual psychology and at the social constructs around an individual, and also how permissible it is to express pain in a culture. And I came across the work of John Sarno when I was looking into my own experience with back pain and headaches. And Sarno, he's a subject of a great documentary called All the Rage, which you can find online. But Sarno quoted Snoopy, that great contemporary philosopher, saying, "There is nothing like a little physical pain to keep your mind off of your emotional problems." He also said, if you ask people to ease up on you because you're emotionally overloaded, don't look for a sympathetic response, but tell them you've got pain or some other physical symptom, and they immediately become responsive and solicitous. So if Sarno was right that suppressed emotional pain hidden from the conscious mind was implicated in my own chronic conditions, how could I access it? So it was at this point that I got the idea to blend the archetypes of the major arcana with specific characters in my family history. So my family has experienced also a lot of chronic stuff, and most of us can trace conditions across multiple generations. I find this very fascinating. So in my family, we've had multi-generational depression, mental health crises, institutionalization, suicide, severe headaches, and addiction. And I saw that there were also generations and generations of women who didn't possess a lot of agency, and they harbored deep reservoirs of rage and resentment. They may have been brought west against their will. They were very smart women in some cases who lived out unglamorous lives in logging towns and had to deal with unrealized potential, alcoholism, and dimensions of adversity or abuse that were probably never passed down verbally. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll just browse through some of the cards here. So I'll do this one. And let me know when you can see it. Share. Can you see it? Yes? Yes. Okay, good. All right. So I have a lot of love and affection for my family, but I had to create a container that would allow me to express in a really unrestrained way these dark shadows. So this is an unapologetically negative version of my family stories, and I don't want to give the impression that that's all there is. I could have told these stories in a different way. So the story has racial dimensions, which we'll get to. My ancestors were both perpetrators and victims of slave rape. There was a tragic marriage with and an abandonment of a Native woman and her half-Native child. And I wondered a lot about the dimensions of sort of, the karmic dimensions of a history of extraction from the environment in the Pacific Northwest by men who never imagined its wealth of resources could be exhausted. So this, again, it's an act of selective storytelling. So the major arcana begins with the Fool, who sets out on a journey. And in traditional tarot interpretation, this is beginnings, spontaneity, faith, but it's also connected with folly. And so this is my ancestor, and his name was Stephen Wright. He was a real guy, and in 1854, he set out on the Oregon Trail, seduced by the promise of 320 acres of quote-unquote free land, to which white migrants like himself were entitled under the Donation Claim Act of 1850. Although the trail is littered with the bones of dead migrants, the Fool decides to take the journey. The Fool portends folly, stupidity, naivete, and chaos. So these are essentially putting the archetypes of the major arcana onto specific people. And then I wrote a book of interpretation. This is the Octoroon. The Octoroon, Harriet Tempa Hendricks, gains her dusky hue in the Persephonic shadows of a Barbados sugar plantation 3 generations prior, or in the South Carolina tobacco land, where a separate stream of her white forebears thrived and prospered. The name of her African foremother is absent in the records, but speaks decisively through 23andMe in the present day. The Octoroon wears the crest of the proud Scottish clan whose name she sullies as she sits on a throne crowned with cotton and with tobacco at her feet. Her westward move to the Ozark Mountains hides her secret in an unlocked box, but shame peeps in. Migration to Oregon carries her granddaughter into creamed coffee glamour, a blur of curls, belle of the class of 1938. Does she know who is the last to speak of it? Plagued by depression and marriage to an Arkansas bigot, the Octoroon presages stagnation, domestic problems, tragic pregnancy. And there's the slave driver. This is a card about the sort of rifts between the generations as they moved from agrarian and working class folks to become educated, and the sort of interruption in the stream of values and folkways. So these are very ugly. They're very grotesque, and that's purposeful. I think they were. It's very useful to have a reservoir for what is unacceptable. This is the Chariot, which bears Emily Durgan, wife of the Fool, Stephen Wright, west from the New England of her Puritan ancestors. Crowned by the Leviathan cross, the alchemical symbol for the stink of sulfur, this starched and pressed wench walks alongside her linens, dishes, dresses, Bible, and 4 children into a vivid hell. As many as 30,000 fall dead on the trail from disease, drowning, gunshot, starvation, stabbing, madness, suicide, wandering off, or being dragged under wagon wheels. The Chariot prefigures the dropped thread, scattered energies, calamity, loss of direction, self-doubt, and vertigo. So I'm going a bit over time, but this is the chief in Tacoma, Washington, where I grew up, who was hung for refusing to give up that land. Upside down face was the name of the Salish for the white people. Loss of children, moving up into the middle class, addiction, alcoholism, a suicide at Oregon Mental Hospital. So these cards could be used as objects of contemplation. They could be used for dialogue, a written dialogue. They could be used to divine the nature of a moment as a way of accessing the unconscious, or they could even be ritually destroyed. And it ends with the world, with the corporate logos of the companies that both sustained our family, that we made money from, and the foods that we consumed as we watched television in the 1970s. So that's the end of my talk. I found it very healing to make these cards, and the fact that they do contain such dark material, I think, is key to the fact that I found them so illuminating. can't hear you.
I didn't say anything.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay.
Wow. And then will you introduce Erik?
I would love to. Thank you. Erik Norbie is a writer and poet with work published in journals such as Image, Bellevue Literary Review, Columbia Poetry Review, Journal of the American Medical Association, and elsewhere. After leaving the study of medicine, he worked to change the way students and professionals in the health sciences are trained, including expanding the role of the humanities. And he has presented his research nationally and internationally. Currently, he's an MFA candidate at the University of Montana, where he also teaches.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks for that incredible presentation. I am going to read a few pages from a fiction story. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview about the story because I'm just reading you an excerpt from the middle of the story. The story is about a middle-aged man named Martin who received a bone marrow transplant as a treatment for cancer. Initially, the transplant seemed to work, but a couple of months later, he learns that the transplant is failing. Most of the story takes place on a beach with a pier, a large pier that has like a Ferris wheel and food stands that Martin and his wife, Olivia, have visited for the afternoon. Unbeknownst to Olivia, Martin has started communicating with Emmeline, and she is the person who donated her bone marrow to Martin for the transplant. And as Martin faces sort of the prospect of his life ending, he's trying to understand this selfless act of Emmeline's donation and how to talk to Olivia about wanting to transition to hospice. So I will just go ahead and read. It's about 4 pages here. They reached the pier. The wooden planks were rough and wide, and Martin leaned into Olivia. People had formed a line for ice cream in front of a small kiosk. They joined the line, and as they waited, Martin slipped his hand into his pocket and felt for the folded notebook paper. 3 days ago, Martin had received the letter. He hadn't expected a response, especially not so soon. It was forbidden, the case manager had said, to contact the donor. The policy was 3 years, an emotional embargo of sorts. Even then, the donor information would remain confidential. But the name of Martin's donor had been left in his chart by accident. And he tracked an Emmeline Sonberg to an address on the other side of the country. It seemed unlikely to be the Emmeline Sonberg, but he'd written her a note. It was short and more formal than he'd intended. The card was from the hospital gift shop, and it had an abstract rendering of flowers on the front. He'd sent it a month ago when it still appeared the transplant might work. It read like a thank you letter to a colleague. Martin held the ice cream cone by his mouth as if speaking into a microphone. He felt like a child, embarrassed to want to enjoy something so simple, lapping at it, the stickiness around his lips, the syrupy aftertaste coating his throat. He looked at Olivia, but instead of her, he saw himself in her large tinted sunglasses, his face bulging where the lenses curved, which only added to the swollen distortions that the steroids and immunosuppressant drugs had wrought. His whole body felt distended, disfigured. Olivia smiled at him, and it made him suddenly angry, that she might be happy, that she might look at him and feel happiness. Of course, that was the truth of it. He was angry with himself, ashamed of himself. Since the side effects of the drugs had become visible, he'd become embarrassed for Olivia when they went out. That she had to walk next to him, be seen with him, all the more noticeable next to her long limbs and narrow shoulders, the light, poised gait of a dancer. The color of the ocean kept changing. From the pier, Martin looked down at it. It seemed heavy, the way it moved, sloshing and smacking the pilings, rushing and then slowing forward and backward, undecided. The transplant had been carefully planned. The donor cells, Martin was told, had to be immediately flown across the country in a cooler, the kind that looked like a large plastic lunchbox with a handle. A single person had carried it the entire way, through ticketing, through security, into a bathroom stall, beneath the airplane seat, in the taxi, door to door. It seemed unimaginable. It seemed like a sequence in a dream. Emmeline's reply came in purple ink, with large looping handwriting on notebook paper. She was 20 years old and a sophomore at Boston College. A roommate had convinced her to register as a bone marrow donor. She'd been surprised to be matched so soon after. She was studying music and she also enjoyed painting, but her parents wanted her to choose a more practical path, something like pre-law. She had never been to California, but she'd always wanted to go. Was it really as beautiful as all the pictures? What was Hollywood like? Maybe after college she would move there. One of her friends grew up in a place called Ojai. Had he been there? She'd asked. Did he have kids? What kind of music did he like? Had he ever been to Boston? By the second sentence, tears had blurred Martin's vision. By the end, he was sobbing with startling, hiccuping gasps. He'd reread the letter several times, keeping it hidden otherwise. He'd been thinking about what to write back. Should he tell her it was failing now? He knew there wasn't much time. He had to get a response written down, have it mailed. He was thinking of including Olivia's phone number. They walked along the pier. A fisherman was smoking, the line of his pole disappearing over the edge. An old man was grasping his ice cream cone, a large ball of green dripping down his hand. He pressed his leathery tongue to it, his eyes opening, and it all seemed like a practical joke now, coming here like this, as if the whole thing were a movie set, hurried into place. Though Martin had forgotten his script, the words he'd rehearsed gone. A small dog growled at him. A line of pennant flags, strung between posts, flapped lazily in the breeze. Tongues of fire engine red and marigold yellow and primary blue. Up close, the magic of the Ferris wheel was ruined. A large diesel motor chugging noisily, a teenager pushing a button. A ride cost 12 tickets, and many of the bulbs were burned out. But Martin and Olivia paid for 24 tickets and waited in the loosely formed line. Martin felt again for the folded letter in his pocket. He wanted to share the letter with Olivia. He wanted to invite Emmeline to visit. Maybe she could stop by on her way to Ojai to see her friend. He imagined they would sit on the patio, their oversized red deck chairs facing the ocean. Martin had already tried writing 2 letters, replying to Emmeline, and he'd thrown both of them away. They'd been long and rambling. One had been full of advice, the other dark and mostly a list of regrets. Right, so I am going to introduce our next author. This is Amy Ratto Parks. Amy Ratto Parks' poetry, fiction, and essays appear in literary, popular, and academic journals. She is the author of the verse novel, Radio Bloom, as well as 3 books of poetry, How to Remember the World, Song of Days, Torn and Mended, and Bread and Water, Body, the winner of the Merriam Frontier Chapbook Prize. She teaches writing at the University of Montana and is the executive director of the Institute of Health and Humanities.
Thank you, Erik. I have 5 poems that I'm going to read that sort of that all connect to each other. They're from some different times of my life. I'm going to read first. I have 2 poems. Some of my poems really pretty directly take on this and thinking about the actual just physical functions of how a body works or how my body works, or like Jenny was saying too, really come out of experiences that I physically have, and I'm trying to make sense of, or make story out of, or create sense out of, by writing about them. And so I'm going to read two poems that are really just very directly about my heart to start. And this first poem is called Dear Heart for the Arrhythmic. Dear heart, and when I say this, dear heart, I do not mean to conjure a deer's heart pumping hopeless and wild around the puncture of a hunter's arrow. Nor do I mean dear heart as in sweetie pie, honey, or my love. What I mean to do is address you, my heart, the incorrigible fish thrashing against my ribs. You, the thick-valved compass guiding me from the womb since before I had hands or hair or lips. You, the fat red clock rocking me across the hot tarmac of life, saying, no, walk away, or always forgive, or yes, love him, and often do it if you must, but it will crush me. So far you have freighted me onward, lurching forward and falling back like the town drunk, trying to find comfort because, my dear, I have been unkind to you, cracking you open with life's hammers. Is it too late to say I love you, to say that I study and follow your steady directives, to say that I pray to you like a thing I may have already lost? The next poem is a section out of a longer poem. And the longer poem was a 5-part piece about the experience of anaphylactic shock and healing from that. I had a funny treatment from it, so I didn't just kind of spontaneously bounce back. I had a very long sedate month or two where I wasn't really surfacing. So a lot of the poem takes place underground, which is sort of how I felt. And this section is called Pomp. My little boat is made of wood and bound with brackets of brass. It fits only me, head to toe. The oil-wicked flame in the prow is very small, only so big as this one finger, but it throws shadows on the ceiling and walls while I float across the great black lake. I like to think of the shadows as writing I cannot understand. I like to think of them as the calligraphy of purpose that fills the people walking on the ground above me. I like to think of that scatter show as the mirror to the great depth below me, which, I like to think, goes on forever. The boat rocks me in my bones. Its oarless shifting turns my breath to remembering itself and leads my heart back to a steady pomp, pomp, pomp in the fat, winding veins. The royal sweep of the heart, always steady on until the moment it's not. Dear heart, take solace in this rocking. Do you see the way I bow to you? Do you see me kneeling in this small, small boat? I long for the golden weight of guests or the stern command of a clock or some otherness to interrupt all of this dark quiet. I watch the flame dip and dance and wonder, can't you hear it up there? Can't you feel this symphony of silence spreading out beneath your feet, pounding percussive at your foundations? It says, listen, listen, listen. My whole body is nothing but listen. The next poem that I want to read, I wrote in January, and it shifts gears a little bit to thinking about the idea of diagnosis and the idea of language, and putting language on an experience and what happens with that. And so this poem is one of a recent poem that I've written, and it was written before I really knew anything about COVID happening in January. But I had, as I don't know, maybe all people do, maybe this isn't weird, gone into a funny imaginative pathway of thinking about what happened if I had gotten some terrible diagnosis, like how would I react versus how I react when other people have a diagnosis. And so that's where this poem comes from. It's called Notes on My Future Diagnosis. I would probably still go to Costco and wander the wide cement aisles, holding the list I'd made that morning. I'd walk along thinking, how much butter or how much bread, but the new word would peck at me and I'd keep hearing the doctor's voice in my head. I'd keep seeing the way her shoulders lifted to deliver the granite egg of her news in a shroud of gentleness. I'd watch her mouth making plans for me while I said thank you to the old man handing me samples of cheese and seedy crackers. Some people say they imagine preparing for battle, but there's nothing strong inside me except the doctor's brick words, which slowly assemble themselves, stacking tall the slow masonry of my fear. Already it weighs my feet to the ground. Already it keeps me from taking in enough air. Or maybe the words are hammers let loose to crack the mortar, the me of myself who walks the warehouse floors thinking, here I am, holding death inside me like a spoiled, broken fruit. I would decide to buy provisions. I would pile my cart with bottled water, blankets, batteries, a new radio. Despite everything I know, I would try to be plywood ready, sandbag ready. I would shelter in place. I would hunker down. I would tune the signal of myself to the new weather, yellow and brown and boiling on the horizon. When I reread this poem yesterday, thinking about this reading, I thought, gosh, if I only had put toilet paper somewhere in this poem, it would have really just captured everything. But it still did haunt me by March, reading this poem and thinking about all of the things. So I have two more poems to read that take a different angle. So in this chapbook, Song of Days Torn and Mended, one of my goals was to actually try to be able to write about the other end of the health experience. What does it feel like to feel healthy? What does it feel like to feel able-bodied and content and pain-free? And what does that lightness feel like, and why is that also so hard to capture in writing? So I have two poems. One is called Song of Wounds and Scars. Never mind, I'm a fast healer. Wounds push close like film in reverse with all the grainy stop action of memory. Not sympathy, no, but something else. Can't you just look at this? Every wound can eventually pull closed, but even so, each sealed mouth, each gathered pucker of old scar is skin's hem-stitched evidence of something too rough. And in the meantime, all we can see is the yellow process of cleansing. My grandmother once healed herself by collecting gold candy wrappers. She taped them end to end and bound them tightly around a pencil. Her goal was to make a path around the perimeter of her house. At some point, that happened. My sister eats ginger until her throat burns. She avoids planes and cars for long distance. She convinces herself that she is a cool glass bowl. Hunger is the sharp edge shaving my insides clean. A grassy plain spreads wide behind my angular bones built to hold so many things, and I'm filled with ideas of tenderness. This too wants to hold on. This too wants to say something. So for this last piece, this is one of my favorite poems because it always makes me feel happy again when I read it out loud, unlike other poems that make me actually feel sad when I read them again. This poem makes me feel a sense of lightness and happiness. We'll see if it translates. It's called Song for the Buoyant Thistle Body. In the bright dome of the forest, the path ascends slowly out of the morning fog. Somewhere nearby, there are houses with newspapers on the stoop and shapely topiary gardens in the yard. But here, the canopy's yellow gold burns wild. The red brush lions against your shins, and you want to run ahead because you sense that suddenly everything has been returned from the edge of memory and flickers in bright shadow like red fruit behind red leaves. This is not riddle or koan. You know this in your bones, in your drowsy child's mind. If the body is made to crater under life's dark weight, then surely it is made for this day, swollen with the salts of joy. The heart's crowded aviary crashes its fine cage. The skin, each pore a buzzing apiary, lifts. Walk forward and wait to be gathered back under the warm wing of the lost familiar. The sky cracks ever open. In this moment, you know there is always more to you than you. The buoyant thistle body blooms. Hold fast, hold fast. Wash in the day's wide basin of happiness. All right, so I would like to introduce Danielle. Danielle Cooney graduated recently from the MFA program at the University of Montana, where she studied cross-genre writing and taught poetry. She was the lead coordinator for Second Wind Reading Series, worked as a poetry editor and social media coordinator for Cutbank Literary Magazine, and was a coordinator of the Montana Book Festival volunteer effort, among other things. She is a 2019-2020 Ridge Scholar for the Institute of Health and Humanities, and her poetry has appeared in Persona and the inaugural issue of the Journal for Latina Critical Feminism. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you. Thank you both Jenny and Eric too for joining me on this panel. For Amy, thanks to Amy for putting it together, and Lauren and China for hosting us. happy to be back participating in Montana Book Festival in some capacity this odd year. So I've written some things down that I think my writing might echo in the things that all of you have already read. So obviously tracing pain, but maybe the more hidden types of pain, thinking about anxiety a lot, maybe rage, but in different forms. The pain we talk about that's more visible and tangible. That sort of pain, I think, probably is what got me interested in this topic, or that sort of realm of the health field. My sister has a congenital heart condition, so I grew up at hospital visits and grew up in the hospital basically. And that pain, I realized that like physical, visible, tangible pain that she underwent with multiple surgeries through her lifetime and still grapples with today, easier to talk about than the anxiety that I realized I was had likely inherited from both sides of the family as well. One side of my family has a diagnosed generalized anxiety disorder that I didn't know about until adulthood. And so thinking about the intersection, I think, of mental health and physical pain, physical health is where sort of like maybe where that little pocket where my writing lives. And like any good scab, I just can't stop picking at it. So some of this writing that I'm going to share today might be like a little bit fresh because I am adding to this constantly. I think the more that I think about it, the more that I talk to others and hear echoes of my own thoughts and vice versa, the more it transforms. So bear with me if parts sound maybe a little bit rockier and less practiced than others. This project is called Nerve Endings. This is the first 5 pages of it, and it will likely grow until, I don't know, until I let go. Nerve Endings. Lately death, lately dying. Where does the energy go when we are grieving? The women in my family wake after surgery, crying, not in pain, in some sort of mourning, some sort of some gosmic grip on reality, bright light timeline. That summer I cried. The anesthesiologist said I rambled on about being elsewhere, not belonging. There, the bed. Swimming in and out of dreamed states. Said I bargained for more of the before. The surgeon mentioned there was a chance I wouldn't regain feeling in the parts of my leg that continued to prickle after I woke. Repair successful, all but quite routine for otherwise strong ligaments and cartilage, but for the obliterated tissue. The surgeon said without the necessary invasion, my knee would continue to function on a basic level, would be capable of forward movement, but no ability to change direction. So the surgeon said the repair of the tendon was successful, but for the unleashing of emotion, but for the numbness in my shin that lingered after waking. This worried me in the moment, but less with time, less when the dulled sense of engagement became part of how my shin now interacts with the elements. Only noticeable when I press into the skin after 7 years. Taut the same way the gums around my molars house compressed timelines within my jaw. Each of these sensations alleviated by direct pressure. Some nights we were all output. Tonight is not that night. Tonight is all output contained. I reach for you across the bed, a phantom limb, breath, vibration. I learned to stack objects in the place you used to occupy. I never liked taking the entire bed, and you know this, but you haven't stacked objects. You filled the space in other ways, In other ways, dead nerve endings scare me because I don't know the statistical likelihood of regaining. Incalculable, that feeling. By that feeling, I mean you. I mean reaching out and not feeling you, feeling 3 half-filled notebooks, someone's first novel, someone else's poems about their dead father, a box of tissues, a pillow paralleling my torso, pressing into my body to alleviate the pressure. At 17, I needed to be pricked multiple times, first the left and then the right. They couldn't find the vein to sedate me for removal, but I held still until I'd been pricked so many times my mother intervened, asked for someone different, someone who could see through the translucent layer of skin stretched over the pit of the elbow. The drugs entered instead through the wrist, and when I woke, I cried every time someone looked at me, every time someone didn't. Earlier that same year, Kay Lang had reacted violently, vomited for days, blood and Vicodin. Her face swelled and bruised Violet Beauregard minus the chewing. Something about a snotty screenshot of her gauze-stuffed face made me fear my own wisdom tooth extraction. So maybe my veins went into hiding. Maybe my nerves fought that battle for me. Lost anyway, still went under. Who is the first one to say that thing about the pennies right before you get sick? I don't think I've ever tasted pennies. Maybe cotton. Maybe it's possible to taste shag carpet in the shape of a tennis ball. Have you ever thrown up in one of those small trash cans in a hotel? You know, the ones probably only meant for tissues or discarded notepad paper. How about the bathroom of a Mimi's Cafe, maybe behind a retaining wall outside of a trendy new brunch spot in downtown Denver? I know there's nothing like hurling in the comfort of your own home, but if you've never been sick outside that French bakery where the fish from Pike Market mingle with fresh baked bread and ground coffee, maybe you should try it sometime. Maybe you should stick your head in a garbage can in the middle of a crowd and wonder, am I pregnant? A year ago, I asked my nurse if the reminder card for my copper IUD removal is something I should put on the fridge, asked if it came in a magnet form, asked if they wouldn't mind laminating it for me first. My nurse offered to hold my hand. I held my face instead, covered my eyes, but when I felt her move away, I reached out, just wanted her to be close to me to laugh when I said, next time, I'd just shove a stack of pennies up there. Call it a day. When you move to a new place, you want to know about the neighborhood, right? You want to know how the school districts are. I Google where the nearest Planned Parenthood is, the cross streets of the closest location for safe abortions. This is preemptive. This is because I never took stats, never understood probabilities, so I worry if I fall into the minority category of beings who, despite plans with all the letters, still feel that panic set in. My best friend from high school fell for her architecture professor. We know how that ended, but did you know the more times you take Plan B, the less effective it becomes? Did you know Plan B will only make you bleed if the sperm in fact ran the marathon, made it, met the egg? All things I'm too afraid to look up for myself. Did you know those handful of years ago when it was you and me, not her, not the professor? I did. I bled. In kindergarten, I fractured my wrist, dancing in socks, gliding across the kitchen floor. In the first grade, I wore a wrist brace on the wrong arm, having convinced myself that there was still pain hidden somewhere in my forearm. You told me once that your dad set your wrist back in place in the middle of a playground. The incision scar on the soft tissue above your thumb joint. Small, precise, home. The deer have bitten the heads off 5 tulips in the backyard. I stare at the headless stems, the clean break. The year I learned the French invented the guillotine was the same year I had my wisdom teeth pulled, was the same year I watched my dad collapse in the seat next to me during lunch one bright Sunday in April. Now, almost exactly 10 years to the day, he checks into the hospital again. This year is the same year I've learned what an ungulate is. Instead of wearing his watch to school, hidden under a too big sweatshirt every day for a week until he came home from the hospital, I'm in the backyard of a rental, clipping what's left of yellow tulips that I didn't plant. Occasionally, I let my neighbor's cats in with the understanding there's no obligation to linger. They float out through different windows. We exchange pleasantries and they're never hungry, which I've always thought odd. Occasionally, I crawl into the bed of a man who isn't you. He stands far enough not to touch me in the middle of a soccer field. I'm doubled over. He asks if this pain is normal. I say, of course. I say, have you never felt your uterus try to collapse in on itself in a cramped scream of objection to the voluntary insertion of a T-shaped object? Haven't you been sweaty in front of someone you don't really know except in a naked sort of way? Felt simultaneous bloating, tightening. When you double over, you can only go so far upside down. The roundness of your abdomen prevents you from actual relief. I breathe in through my nose and pant out a joke about adjustment periods. Blink back tears I know he won't touch me in my pain. I know he won't do anything more except wait for me to keep walking. I know he knows I won't let him. I waited until morning to ask what his worst injury was. Explained about I'd been thinking about distance, location, separated tendons, only admit to scars that are apparent to the naked examination. He points to bruises on my legs, suddenly fresh, purpling. He dabs a silver blue burn salve on my knuckle. One morning before work, I ask if he yells when he's angry. I ask if he thinks we have anything in common. Thank you.
I know. Oh, that was great. Wow, what a awesome like weaving of pieces in all of these in all of our readings. I was thinking it's funny. I mean, before we started this, we had some questions we thought about, but I wondered if what other things you all are thinking about after listening to everyone's readings, because I see a lot of threads, and you mentioned something, Danielle. I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts before.
Well, I think, Jenny, you had said something about like the permission, or if it were permissible to express pain, and how that differs by culture and family. And you had said something, Danielle, about, I think, related to that, to when it's acceptable, or to the ways in which that allows us to connect with someone. And I thought that was interesting, to what you were saying, Amy, about how we also, it's difficult to when it's appropriate or permissible to express joy, or and how we sort of reconcile those two. And I think, I'm super interested in how literature and can inform healthcare training, or professionals in healthcare, and how it's oftentimes we don't think those two things can coexist, or that when someone expresses pain, they're expressing more than just a physical moment. So I thought it was really neat to see these different pieces come together to connect to that.
I think so too. And something that made me, I found myself thinking about with kind of my works look at like some things that are the diagnostic elements, just like both of you, Erik and Danielle, are also talking about things that are the diet. We have actually in all of ours like these terminology or diagnoses that are kind of woven through. And even Jenny was thinking about like family history, or like the way there is evidence that supports diagnoses. Like with the physical body and with family history, we can find evidence of a thing. We can find documentation, or we can find test results, which only tell a partial story of the experience. And I think that's interesting up against thinking about a spiritual or emotional pain or sensation, because there isn't the same sort of evidence that supports our experience. So one thing I was thinking about in listening is how we expect people to share the story of an emotional experience, but it's because we have evidence, we can find a physical experience. Sometimes the story of it can be questioned, because we're like, but that's not exactly the thing. I mean, a lot of people have those stories of going in to say something's going on, or I have this experience. And then the response will be, but that isn't what, that looked normal on a test, that everything looked fine. And you're like, but it doesn't feel fine. I don't feel fine. And so even the story of symptoms, or the language of symptoms, becomes a narrative of experience in some way, which, especially thinking about medical training and some of the context of opening up how we hear the story being shared.
Yeah, because I feel like there's definitely a fear that that will somehow impinge clinical objectivity or professionalism when it's, you know, it's really just the opposite. That's how we come to understand trauma and um, yeah, that's experience.
I think that's interesting too. That like idea of professionalism and what it looks like to, or what we're allowed to talk about and not talk about in different like social circles. Term that, or two terms actually. I think Jenny mentioned biopsychosocial of pain. Biopsychosocial is so intriguing and comprehensive. But then also thinking about the grotesque and like how looking at something head on, whether it's physical and like visually or otherwise tangible, like Erik, your descriptor of Martin and the way he looks now that the treatment's really taken a toll on his body. But yeah, thinking about that intersection of like grotesque and also not wanting to maybe admit to what is truly occupying like all parts of ourself. That psychosocial, yeah, that word is just, it really is all encompassing, like with the physical, the bio, the mental health, both with coping with physical pain and diagnoses or otherwise, and then social, like how we relate to others and how that changes as we navigate like our own internal processing of whatever it is that we're going through.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you receive a diagnosis, how the language is so impactful. And so my son received a diagnosis of cerebral palsy at 18 months. And, you know, there was sort of like, will he or won't he have it for a year and a half, you know, leading up to that. And I just remember the language in which the news was delivered and the documents that you subsequently received, that all of us have received about diagnoses and the language and you know, the way in which words are neurological events. You know, words can accentuate pain, they can relieve pain, and even the way we talk about our pain can make it worse or better. And so this is just such an intersection with poetry, which is so sensory and beyond the verbal, with image and sound and, you know, putting you in a different place. But I find it so interesting that, you know, this is involved with opioid networks and serotonin and the amygdala, and like, you know, that language is basically like massaging our brain, creating realities. And just knowing that we're so caught up in this hyper rational, hyper scientific, hyper, you know, I want to say masculine, but you know, this way of looking at the body, and that and thinking of the symbol for the doctor, the snake wrapped around the rod, right? And that snake as a that whispered in the ear of Asclepius the secrets of healing and wisdom and resurrection is the symbol of the feminine. And to go in,
it makes me think too, when you're talking about the senses, how the main senses, the physical senses that we often talk about when we're working with image, or we're really trying to hone how we create a scene. And a lot of times the basic senses we think of are the really outward facing senses, like sight, smell, taste, touch, feel. They're the things that where we interact with the world around us. But the other sensory experiences that researchers know about are the ones where we're sensing the internal functions of our body, like sensing where we are in space, sensing if we're balanced or not, our sensory ability to understand the function of our own bodies, like the sense of hunger is a sensory experience, or and that's where a lot of those sensations we don't even necessarily call pain sometimes, or we don't know what to call them, because they're so much a part of how we just operate we don't think of them as something different maybe than how other people operate until something isn't going well with those things.
Mhm.
But it's interesting to me that we think only so much about the external, the way the world is touching us or we're interacting with the world, instead of what happens sort of in an internal system of just the ecosystem of one individual body. Uh, yeah, I think just the language of that is very interesting in terms of like thinking about building images or scenes, or because we know that experience of being suddenly losing balance and what that feels like on the inside, but it's unique for all of us. Well,
Yeah, I
I'm
get a strong, oh, sorry.
go ahead.
I get a strong sense of that in your anaphylaxis series too, of that sensation of realizing something about your body, maybe that you didn't realize before, and then how you negotiate that. And also in that arrhythmia poem, which I really like.
Well, it's interesting because if we haven't had any attention on a thing and then we have a sensory experience, it automatically feels wrong. So, which is just a natural human, I guess, just a human thing that we do. We're like, that's new, it's weird, something must be wrong. Instead of sometimes there's just a new, like becoming pregnant is a great example of that, where you're I can't tell if this is wrong or right. It's a new thing. I don't know what category to put it in. And it makes for interesting writing in that way in terms of like physiology, but illness does the same thing. It makes us have a heightened awareness of a thing we don't recognize, but we don't usually respond to it with, excitement and curiosity. We usually respond to the new sensations with a sense of foreboding or anxiety a lot of times. But well, I'm looking at our time and I think we're just about at time, unless we have any concluding comments. And Jenny, you had wanted to mention a workshop you were doing.
Oh, yes, I'm teaching an make your own Oracle deck class at the Zootown Arts Community Center in October. So that'll be listed on their website.
And so would that be in time for Halloween? It seems like.
Yeah,
there could be like a burning of cards.
That's right.
That's great. All right. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up. And thank you all if you're hung around. See you soon.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Thank you to Jenny Montgomery, Erik Norbie, Amy Ratto Parks, and Danielle Cooney for coming together for this timely conversation and sharing your powerful works. And thank you to everyone watching. Just as a reminder, you can purchase books by our Montana Book Festival authors and many others at Fact and Fiction's website, factandfictionbooks.com. I also urge you to purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. There you can also donate so that we can continue our programming after the festival with our MBF Plus events. Thank you, everyone.
Mm-hmm.